November 7, 1994. The Los Angeles Fire Department responds to a car burning out of control.
The pile of charred human remains that firefighters discovered in the fall of 1994 was only a prelude to a dark tale of jealousy and love gone awry. Initially, investigators believed a carjacker may have torched his victims in an effort to conceal his crime. The truth was far more tragic, and in the end, an entire family would be destroyed. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
Los Angeles Sheriff's detectives Ray Peavy and Ron Lancaster were on call in the night of the murder.
Patrol deputies were there, the fire department was there, they had extinguished the fire when we got there. They were telling us that they believed that there was only one victim on the back seat that was covered by like a blanket or something.
As the corpse was removed, detectives realized that what appeared to be a smoldering blanket was actually something far more horrifying. A second victim's body had been fused to the first by the intense heat of the fire.
They were so badly burned that the two bodies had pretty much melted together. The two bodies were probably that of an adult male and an adult female.
Why don't we pop the trunk?
When investigators opened the trunk, they were suddenly faced with a triple homicide.
Looks like a male, actually not nearly as burned as the ones in the back seat. Young guy.
He was burnt, but certainly not burnt beyond recognition, as were the other two bodies.
We ran the license plate of the vehicle and found that it was registered to a Danny Charles that lived about maybe a mile and a half from where the car had been set on fire.
Police traced the car to an exclusive neighborhood in Fullerton, California. Detectives Peavy and Lancaster were met at the door by an elderly gentleman named Bernard Severino.
Outside, please. We're from the Sheriff's Homicide Bureau.
Severino said that he lived at the residence with his daughter Dolores Charles.
We need to go inside and spend a little bit of time and
his son-in-law, Edward Charles Sr.
We can answer all your questions.
And his grandson, Danny.
Thank you.
We asked, is Danny Charles here? He said, no, I haven't seen him all day. We asked Bernie if his daughter and son-in-law were at home, and he said, no, I have not seen them either.
There are three bodies in the car. The bodies are that of a young man and an older male and female.
We explained to Mr. Severino that they had found a car and that there were some dead people in the car, and we believed it to be them.
We asked him if there was any other family members. He said, well, I have another grandson. His name is Eddie Charles.
Eddie Charles, a 22-year-old auto mechanic, was the eldest son. According to the grandfather, the entire family had dinner together on Sunday night when a fight broke out.
We have a big problem. $10,000. Hey, Grandpa, why don't you just,
Eddie's parents were outraged that he had charged over $10,000 on his mother's credit card. He spent the money on tuition for his new girlfriend, Tiffany Bowen. Tiffany was a 24-year-old model who picked up spending money by appearing as a bikini-clad extra in the TV series Baywatch. It took only one look at the curvaceous blonde for Eddie Charles to fall desperately in love.
Tiffany was somebody that normally I don't believe Eddie could have probably said hi to. Tiffany was a nice-looking girl, and Eddie just fell head over heels with her. He thought, in his mind, to keep her in the lifestyle that she was accustomed to, that they would have to spend a lot of money, and here he is working in a gas station at minimum wage.
You Eddie Charles?
Yeah.
Peavy and Lancaster interviewed Eddie Charles at his place of employment, a gas station 3 miles from where the bodies were discovered.
I was at the house.
We're asking him about his parents, his brother, when the last time he saw him. We talked to him for at least 15 or 20 minutes before he ever asked us when we're there.
We believe, in fact we know, that your mother and father and your brother are dead.
When detectives told Eddie that his parents and brother were dead, he broke down. Detectives Peavy and Lancaster then returned to the Charles neighborhood, looking for any potential witnesses. One neighbor remembered hearing a shout coming from the trunk of a Honda.
She ran back to her house, called 911, but when the police got there, the car was gone.
A second neighbor recalled seeing Eddie Charles at his parents' home the morning after their disappearance.
That's where he was down on his knees and cleaning something up in the driveway.
He said that on Monday morning he got up early. He looked across the street and he observed Eddie Charles in the driveway of the house, and he was down on his hands and knees washing something off of the driveway.
Detectives had heard enough. Eddie Charles was now the prime suspect in the murder of his own family. They sought a search warrant for the Charles home. What they uncovered would bring them face to face with a killer overwhelmed by jealousy and lust. Heidi Robbins was in charge of gathering forensic evidence at the Charles home.
I began to focus in on the bedroom where the 2 parents slept. Right upon walking into that bedroom, I noticed the blood spatter in the room. Someone had attempted to remove the bloodstains. You could see a white Ajax-type film on the front surface of the nightstand. The blood spatters that I found in that room signify that there was a violent struggle in that room that was bloody.
DNA tests of the blood found in the bedroom identified Eddie Charles Sr. as the donor. However, no blood from Dolores or Danny Charles was discovered at the house. Detectives felt they now had enough evidence to arrest Eddie Charles.
You Eddie Charles? Could you stand up for me, please?
Eddie was taken into custody, booked, and charged with the murders of Edward, Dolores, and Danny Charles. It fell upon Orange County Deputy District Attorney David Brent to build a case against Eddie Charles.
Shortly after Eddie was in custody, he began to talk about the crimes in different ways. The first thing Eddie did within a week after being arrested was to call his grandfather, Bernie Severino.
Oh, Grandpa? Yeah, it's Eddie.
Eddie asked Bernie to take blame for the murders.
I got my whole life ahead of me, right? And
Eddie said that Eddie was young and Bernie was old, and besides, his girlfriend Tiffany was pregnant.
I think you should take the fall for this.
Bernie just simply hung up on him.
I miss you so much.
Tiffany visited Eddie in prison on a regular basis
Get out of here.
and continued to believe in his innocence. For the time being, Eddie still had his Baywatch babe. But Eddie decided that she wasn't going to stick around long if he remained in jail, and he had no intention of losing her. Eddie reached out to a cellmate and unveiled his scheme to regain his freedom.
Eddie mentioned that it would be good if he could find somebody to come in and kill his grandfather and get caught in the act. That way the police would focus on that person as being the real killer of everyone.
The cellmate immediately contacted the authorities. David Brent could now use his testimony, as well as the grandfather's, to implicate Eddie Charles.
We got a big break when a dumpster diver had gone through a particular dumpster and had found a wrench. The wrench had blood and tissue on it, ultimately, and some hair. She turned in this wrench to the police department. This was a large crescent wrench, very heavy, and on the wrench was a particular tool mark, a yin-yang tool mark. This was a tool mark that Eddie Charles put on each and every one of his tools at the gas station to identify those as his.
Deep within the crevices of that wrench, within the moving mechanism of that wrench, we had bone and tissue and hair samples that were embedded, actually jammed into that moving mechanism. A fellow criminalist was able to recover the skull fragments from the victim, Daniel Charles, and compare the bone to the marks that would have been left by that wrench, and determine, in fact, that the marks left in his skull were consistent with marks left by that particular tool.
Armed with the wrench, prosecutors were ready for trial. But Eddie Charles still dreamed of freedom and firmly believed that one day he would be reunited with his Baywatch babe.
On a brisk autumn night, the hideously burnt corpses of the Charles family were discovered in a school parking lot. The surviving son, Eddie Charles, was arrested for the gruesome crime. Authorities believe that Eddie's passionate love affair with a stunning model triggered an uncontrollable rage that ended with the triple murder of his own family.
Deputy District Attorney David Brent began his case with physical evidence and eyewitness testimony that incriminated Eddie Charles. Yet the prosecution knew that a conviction remained tentative at best, unless they could answer one simple question: why? The prosecution called Tiffany Bowen to the stand.
At the time of the murders, Eddie was living at the Bowen residence, but Tiffany was not at that residence. She was going to cosmetology school back in Maryland. Eddie paid for the school. He also paid for Tiffany to get breast implants. Eddie told her that he had money, that he could do things for her. Eddie didn't tell Tiffany the real source of these funds, which were actually stealing from his parents. Eddie's parents had a life insurance policy, and so by killing them and killing Danny, who would have been an heir also, Eddie stood to inherit probably $300,000 to $400,000.
Tiffany Bowen provided the prosecution with a clear motive: greed, fueled by overwhelming lust.
That manifests itself. What happened to make you feel that?
Well, Eddie always felt that he had to prove his love to me, and he would buy me expensive gifts all the time, such as jewelry, nice clothing, and expensive dinners.
After her testimony, the hard-bodied bikini model refused to see or speak to Eddie Charles again. David Brent then tied all of the evidence and testimony into a neat package. The prosecution presented for the jury their theory of what happened to the Charles family. At around 8 p.m. on Sunday, November 6th, the Charles family argued over Tiffany Bowen. Danny stormed out of the house. According to the prosecution, Eddie left soon after his brother. 4 blocks from the house, Eddie flagged Danny down. He approached Danny's car and hit him with a wrench. Eddie then placed Danny in the trunk.
At 9 o'clock, the neighbor heard someone yell from the trunk of a car that appeared to be a Honda, "Help, somebody help me."
Eddie Charles was next seen at 10 p.m.
There was a co-worker down at the gas station who had seen Eddie drive into the gas station and sort of fumble around in his car for no explanation and then drive away. We know that Ed Sr. and Dolores were alive after 11 o'clock because Mr. Severino saw them alive at that time.
It was then that authorities believe Eddie re-entered the house and murdered his parents. At around midnight, Eddie placed both bodies in the backseat of the car. Prosecutors believe that Eddie left the bodies in the car for approximately 24 hours while he decided on his next course of action. On Monday night, November 7th at 11 p.m., Eddie tried to destroy the evidence.
The case against Eddie started out being a fairly thin case, and yet he continued to do things that made my case get stronger and stronger. Eddie kept talking to people. He kept involving himself in methods he felt would get him out of the fix that he was in, that ultimately only helped the prosecution case get stronger.
Confident of a quick deliberation, Deputy District Attorney David Brent turned the case over to the jury, but Brent was in for a big surprise. On January 9, 1996, Eddie Charles prepares for the jury to decide his fate. Eddie Charles is found guilty of murdering his family.
At that point, a penalty phase was begun for the jury to determine whether or not the penalty should be life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty.
The jury was unable to come to an agreement. 2 more penalty phase trials were held. One ended in mistrial, the other a hung jury. 5 years had passed since Eddie Charles was first taken into custody.
I had to think long and hard about whether we would try to seek a 4th death penalty. To our knowledge, this had never been done before in California or maybe anywhere in the country. We felt that it was important to take one more shot. And that jury came back with a sentence of death.
What surprised me was how a suspect from a loving family could just slaughter his mother and father and brother like that for some Baywatch blonde that he was in lust with at the moment. I found that really tragic.
Eddie Charles is currently awaiting execution at San Quentin State Prison.
While in prison, Eddie Charles received a letter from a woman who was excused during the jury selection of his second penalty trial. They struck up a relationship and were married while Eddie was behind bars.
More from the new arrest and trial next, and officers are left facing a huge investigation.